Good morning and good day to everyone, wherever you are in the world. We are delighted to host this next panel on reparations. As you know, we are celebrating the 150th anniversary of William Monroe Trotter, who was a pioneering social justice activist journalist in American history, and a son of Boston, a son of Harvard. But for this conversation, we're reminded that he spent nearly the whole of his life addressing issues like Jim Crow, segregation, peonage, or debt, slavery, racialized violence, as in lynching. These are the constitutive elements, if you will, of the call and the cry for reparations in our time, this many decades later. And so we have assembled an extraordinary panel of experts, practitioners, scholars, journalists, to speak to this question in this moment. And so I'll just take a moment to introduce a wonderful, wonderful colleague of mine who I believe is standing firmly in that lineage and legacy of activist journalists. That would be Deborah Douglas. She is the co-editor of the Emancipator, which is a collaboration between Boston University and the Boston Globe that reimagines the first abolitionist newspapers for a new day. That is to say, a 2022 day. She wrote the U.S. Civil Rights Trail, a traveler's guide to people, places, and events that made the movement. And I would just simply say it is a wonderful, no plug here, wonderful, wonderful guide. This you need to have in your library. She's also contributed to 400 Souls, a community history of African America. She served as the Eugene S. Pulliam Distinguished Visiting Professor of Journalism at DePaul University and was a senior leader of the Op-Ed Project at Northwestern. She served as Northwestern's Medill School, spearheaded a Civil Rights Act of 1964 graduate investigative journalism project, and she's just been a wonderful colleague in the work. And I know that we're in good hands taking up this critical topic in this difficult time. So with that said, Deborah, just introduce all these wonderful people, and there are lots of folks who are interested and anxious to hear what you all have to say. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'm so happy to be here with all of you today. And I always love doing anything that you're a part of, Professor Brooks. I would like to introduce our distinguished panelists today very briefly, because I want to spend more time hearing from them. First of all, we have in our panel Professor Linda J. Bilmes, a leading expert on budgeting and public finance, and the Daniel Patrick Moynihan Senior Lecturer Chair in Public Policy at the Harvard Kennedy School, where she teaches courses on budgeting and financial management and leads training sessions for newly elected mayors and members of Congress. Her research focuses on how budgetary resources are allocated, particularly with respect to the military, war costs, veterans issues, and the value of public lands and state and local governments. Bilmes previously served as Assistant Secretary and Chief Financial Officer of the U.S. Department of Commerce from 1998 to 2001. Welcome. Aria Florant. Am I saying that right? Florant? All right. As co-founder of Reparations Ventures, a philanthropic and field-building organization fueling the U.S. Black-led movement for racial repair. Prior to Reparations Ventures, Aria served public and social sector clients at McKinsey & Company and helped develop the McKinsey Institute for Black Economic Mobility. She was also an organizer in East Palo Alto, California, focusing on youth development and civic engagement. In 2017, Florant helped launch the first ever round of programs at the Obama Foundation. Yay! Aria received a BA from Stanford University, an MBA from the Wharton School, and an MPA from Harvard Kennedy School. Welcome. And then I will introduce Sydni Scott. Sydni Scott is a senior at Columbia University studying political science and government. And for the past year and a half, Scott has worked as a strategist for the Global Sports Initiative at Harvard University and a research and editorial intern at the Atlantic Fellows for Racial Equity at the Atlantic Philanthropies. Scott recently became the first ever Columbia female student athlete to become a Rhodes Scholar, and in October 2022 will attend Oxford University. Welcome, Sydney.
Thank you so much.
I'm going to just dive into the deep end here, and then we'll work back into how each of you have come to this issue with your work. So my first question for you is addressing reparations an if question or a when question? Professor Bilmes, would you like to kick us off? And you want to come off mute.
Thank you so much, Deborah, and very nice to see the rest of the panel, particularly Aria, who's a long time ago former student of mine. My sense is that really the issue is not if or when, but how, because the US actually has a very long-standing social norm of paying reparatory compensation as a routine mechanism through which the US compensates victims of harms. There are actually hundreds of programs in which we employ this mechanism. And we compensate people who were harmed by exposure to nuclear radiation. We compensate farmers whose crops or livestock were damaged through drought or floods or pests or plant disease or any other reason. We compensate anyone in the fishing industry whose ability to earn a livelihood has been impacted by weather or trade. We compensate people who have been impacted by federal trade agreements. We compensate people who have had adverse reactions to vaccines or other medicines. There is a very long list. In fact, it ranges into the hundreds. And so when I say it is a matter of how, I mean, actually the question of whether or not we should be providing compensations doesn't make any sense to me, given the way the United States actually handles other types of harms. Our system is if A, then B. If there's a harm, then we pay some compensation. And the question becomes what financial mechanisms we use. And I won't take up all my opening time now to discuss it, but there is a whole range of different types of financing mechanisms, a subject of great interest to me, through which we pay for these various types of what I call reparatory compensation.
Great, thank you so much for that. I know, Ms. Florant, you have some thoughts about the if and how question.
I do. I mean, I absolutely think this is a win. I think that Professor Bilmes is doing really, really important research, in particular because in my work and in many of my conversations, what I hear is people using this question of how as sort of a distraction mechanism to take the conversation away from the why and the what. And I think that like what's going to be so amazing when this paper comes out that they're working on is that it will basically say like we actually know how to do this because we do it in so many other areas. And so it will, it like ideally it sort of takes that question of, oh, well, this isn't feasible off the table, and enables the conversation to get back to, the what and the why, and more importantly, how we get enough people on board and really increase public support for this to the point where we will win. So I think it's a win. I think about other movements when I'm, trying to make sure that I'm staying optimistic. Marriage equality, we have more public support for reparations right now than marriage equality did when that movement first began. And so that is always kind of like an anchoring statistic for me, in that, you know, to me, it's a win, but it's a win because I have so much faith in the people that I work with and in, you know, this movement and in Black folks to continue pushing until we see this happen and come to fruition. So I think it's a win because I believe in I think it's a win because I believe in my people.
Okay, thank you so much for that. Sydney.
Yeah, absolutely. I really appreciate what both of you shared. And I actually did not know that statistic. So that's, you know, that sort of contextualizes, you know, how support for things and how movements grow, which I think is really interesting. I definitely agree. I think focusing on the why and the what are really important, because I think especially the if question, it's sort of at the outset puts the conversation onto a path where there is this lack of acknowledgement of the historicity of discrimination against Black people and the sort of ubiquity of the barriers to access of accumulating wealth that have existed for, you know, literally the entire history of this country. And I think it sort of situates it into this place where we're no longer accepting that as a sort of fundamental understanding that there is a debt that is owed that has yet to be repaid. And so I think, you know, I think we definitely try to steer away from this if question, because, you know, it sort of puts you back in that place with the how, which is, you know, the how that Aria mentioned at first, which is, you know, like, how would this even happen? And sort of, is this feasible? And it's not something that's worth considering. And so we, you know, in a lot of our conversations, we focus on the practice and, you know, the people who would be impacted by it, because, you know, focusing on whether or not it's a valid inquiry or not in the first place, is, you know, sort of decontextualizes all of that history.
Yeah, thank you for that. Ms. Florant actually alluded to my next question with the mention of marriage equality, but I'm wondering if we could go a little bit deeper and talk about where the reparations issue stands within the history of social justice. And Professor Bilmes, I would love to hear your thoughts on that, if you can, or any of you. You're on mute.
I think after 2 years, you learn this. I'm speaking to you from the United Nations, where I'm here in my capacity as the United States member of the Committee of Experts. And so we've had quite a week here. And so I apologize if you hear yelling in the background in 165 different languages. So, but I think the UN is a place to start in terms of thinking about this, because the United Nations has actually for quite a few years now been examining the issue of racial justice and has been issuing multiple reports and so on, which look at the nature of reparations in many different circumstances around the world. And the UN has specifically called for reparations in a broad sense for Black Americans in the United States. And I want to say that it is important in the United Nations context to think about this globally. And the way the UN looks at this issue in terms of social justice is that there are several components of a full-scale reparations program, starting with apologies and guarantees of non-repetition, and financial restitution is one of sort of 5 parts of this. And what we see in the United States repeatedly throughout our history is it's kind of a mixed bag. We don't typically do apologies, and what we do, and we do it repeatedly and routinely, discernible harm that Congress takes up, is we provide financial restitution. That is the piece of this overall picture that the United States has repeatedly taken up. And so I think that it's important to think about the fact that this is part of a broader movement worldwide toward social justice, towards reconciliation, toward understanding that what happens today and the way we live our lives today and social equity today is a legacy. It has grown out of what happened before.
Thank you for that.
Yeah.
Ms. Florant, did you want to add something?
Yeah, well, I think that was really important grounding, first of all. And then the other thing that I would just add is that I know that reparations has gotten sort of a lot more attention in the last couple of years. But I do think it's also important to say that this is not a new movement, even within the US at all. This fight began before slavery was even abolished. There are, originally it was 40 acres and a mule that were promised in 1865, but it was Queen Mother Moore at the UN who really brought this to prominence in the 50s. One of the legacy organizations that my organization supports is called NCOBRA, the National Coalition of Blacks for Reparations in America. They were founded in 1987 and have been holding this torch since then, and still going strong. I think that Ta-Nehisi Coates brought it to prominence in 2014, obviously with his piece. But I think what we've seen is sort of these like peaks and troughs of energy, and we're in a peak, but our job is to then be able to sustain that peak and ensure that the peaks continue to get higher and higher.
Thank you so much. Sydney, did you want to add anything?
Sure, yes. I love that you brought up 40 acres and a mule, because I think that it's something that I didn't learn about, when I was in high school. I didn't learn about that until I was in college. And it really foregrounds the idea that reparations is, it's almost an inherent, it's almost a given, like when emancipation, happened, there, you have an entire class of people that were previously unpaid laborers that, what happens to economies, what happens to the land, like what happens practically to to people's lives. And the idea of giving these people, just something to be able to begin to build self-sufficiency and again, build wealth. It was an idea that was pretty inherent to the transition from, legal chattel slavery to emancipation. And so to know that the ideals of the idea of reparations, of being able to, to be able to begin to rectify, was a part of the conversation, so early in our history, I think really, sort of grounds that idea. And I also just think that in terms of social justice, especially as young people engage with it, I think that a lot of these conversations are about conferring benefits and about sort of pursuing, equity, liberation, things like that. And I think that reparations plays a role that constitutes sort of meeting a bottom standard. I think that reparations is, this sort of the first, not the first step, obviously, but, ideologically, the first step towards racial justice, racial equity, because it has to be built upon a barrier, upon a foundation of, of equity. And so I think that, for all of these sort of additional pursuits, I think that reparations is a really foundational tenet to the idea of, social justice and racial justice.
That's awesome. I'm going to come to you again, because now I want to drill down and I want to hear from each of you about how you come to this issue in your work. We're going to get an opportunity to hear from you, Sydney, your work on the ground and your institution building, Aria, and Professor Bilmes, this exquisite paper that you put together. But first, I want to hear from Sydney. Tell us about your work.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So I know I'm sort of, the youngest one on the panel here. I'm only 22. And so especially as Aria just mentioned, reparations work and reparations advocacy has been going on for a very, very, very long time in this country. I'm and internationally, I'm a very new and, sort of humble entrant. But essentially, over the course of 2020, I started doing a research project with a professor at my school, and he was interested in race-conscious policy versus race-neutral policy and public opinion polling and whatnot. And so I was doing some research into race-conscious policy, and I came across Evanston's reparations resolution. And it just was so interesting to me, because I'm a political science major and an African-American studies minor. And even being at, a fairly progressive university, at least sort of academically, I had never encountered the idea of reparations beyond this sort of, political non-starter, this infeasibility. I sort of heard it tossed around, but it was one of those ridiculous things. And so to see that there was a practicable mechanism for reparations, especially, sort of that didn't have to stay within the bounds of cash payouts or, something like that, was really, really interesting to me. So I ended up doing a research project of my own and got really interested in the idea. And essentially I sort of came and I was sitting there and I was like, I've done all of this research. I've thought about this. I've, all of these different feelings. And I think that there are a lot of students and other young people that could be really interested in this idea and find pursuit of this really compelling, that, like me, just hadn't had exposure to the idea that reparations was an expansive topic. And so essentially I started my organization called the Amendment Project, which we call TAP for short, which essentially tries to serve the purpose of bringing young people into the conversation about reparations through essentially political advocacy and lobbying city councils, and also just sort of creating educational material and engaging with students online through workshops in classrooms, things like that. And so, so I sort of, it caught my attention one day and I haven't really been able to let it go since then, but very, very grateful as well to be a part of it with everyone here.
Before I move to Ms. Florant, I just wanted to have you just explain a little bit more about what happened in Evanston, Illinois, because we have a diverse audience and they're coming through different doors to this issue.
Absolutely, sure. So, and again, one of the most exciting things that I've sort of come across in my college career. So essentially Evanston passed the first paid reparations resolution specifically to Black people. And essentially the way it works, it's a housing-based policy. And any Black people who lived in Evanston between, I think it's 1918 and 1969, when the Fair Housing Act was at least, put into practice, are eligible for financial support in securing permanent housing. So, whether that be mortgage support or, whatever that may be, essentially in acknowledgement of the legacy of redlining and the wealth acquisition that Black people were barred from because they weren't allowed to buy houses in non-red district or non-red areas. And so essentially they have I think it's a $10 million fund. And this is also actually available for the descendants of those people as well. But essentially it offers the opportunity for people to pursue permanent home ownership, which again is a huge factor in building wealth. And I think it went into practice. I think it was the final vote was just a couple of years ago. And so that is, that's essentially a little
okay.
That works. Yeah.
I appreciate that. Thank you so much. Ms. Florant.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I came into this work, there's a lot of resonance between my story and Sydney's story. I grew up in Fort Collins, Colorado, which is a mostly white town, as like the only Black girl in all my classes, part of an interracial family. And there were a lot of things that people said to me, experiences that my family had that were really negative, that I didn't have any sort of language or context or understanding of why that was happening, because I wasn't learning about structural racism in school. And so when I went to college, I studied comparative studies in race and ethnicity, and it was like a whole world opened up to me. And it was actually really like a healing process for me. So I have been doing racial justice work since then. And the long story short is that I started thinking a lot about the kinds of things that we need in this racial justice movement. And I felt like a lot of the current activity is really focused on treating symptoms, which is important. But I started asking myself with a co-founder, I said, like, how do we actually get further upstream and start to address these causes at the root cause level, address these issues at the root cause level? And so we sort of identified wealth disparities and white supremacist narratives as two really strong anchors that are holding our unjust systems in place. And the thinking was that if you could shock the system on those two things, you would see positive ripple effects across all of our other systems. And so reparations became that. And we have a comprehensive definition of reparations. We see it as both financial and non-financial. To Professor Bilmes' point earlier about the UN. But when we got into this work, we started learning more about the field of organizations doing this work. And one of the biggest things that we heard was that it's been just chronically underfunded for a very long time. And so Liberation Ventures, organization that I co-founded, supports organizations across the country that are doing different forms of truth, reconciliation, and reparations work. Our North Star is to see federal comprehensive reparations, but our entry point is really to sort of nourish the organizations on the ground and help them sort of be building momentum toward that North Star. So it's we provide funding. We're an intermediary, so we raise and then give out dollars to orgs on the ground. But then we also do non-financial support as well. And then I'll also say, so we believe that it's going to be really important to sort of tell a new story to the country about what reparations is and why repair actually is for everyone and is instrumental in building health, multiracial democracy. And so another sort of area of our work is really about narrative change and building the narrative power of the field to actually set the frame for this conversation. So I will also shamelessly say, because I am someone who's like raising dollars to support other organizations, we have supported Sydney's organization, we've supported Incobra, we've supported Robin Rue Simmons, who was the alderwoman in Evanston, who has now started her own organization. And I want everyone to know in the audience that this organization needs funds. So if you are, and this field needs funds, more importantly. So if you are someone who wants to invest, come and talk to us and we can figure that out.
Thanks so much.
Yeah.
Drum roll, please. Professor Bilmes, tell us about how you came to the issue of reparations.
Thank you. Very interesting to hear your story, Sydney and Aria. So I came to issue of reparations really because a number of my students, most of my career has been spent focused on military spending and thinking about the cost of wars. I am a Quaker, and like many Americans, after the George Floyd murder, I had spent time in meeting just trying to think about whether there was anything that I might be able to do. And shortly thereafter, a number of my former students came to me and said, look, can you work with us on this issue? And I had said, well, I don't know anything about this issue. And they said, yes, but we want someone, they didn't quite say it this way, but as nerdy and wonky as you, to take a look at this issue and look at at it. And so we spent a year working together with Cornell, trying to examine this issue more analytically, and particularly to examine what were to examine and to refute the objections to reparations. Because the main objections, I've read virtually everything that has ever been written on objections to reparations. And when I say objections, I mean objections by serious people. And the objections are one, that slavery was too long ago, two, that the problem is too big for the government to handle, and three, that it's too expensive. So we, in our paper, I think we have pretty much dispelled those questions. First of all, speaking as a baby boomer, we have certainly documented that most Black baby boomers, in other words, anybody born before 1964, who is a Black American, 1964 being the end of the baby boomer phase, was empirically denied the opportunity to build wealth and probably face discriminatory practices in lending, housing, education, transportation, criminal justice, and healthcare, just to name a few. And so we tried to document some of these harms and in the 20th century and how they had evolved from more original harms to try and connect the pieces, connect the dots to the current day legacy. The second question about that the problem was too big is probably the easiest to refute, because in fact, we process millions of claims every year for individuals including veterans with disability benefit issues and vaccine harmed individuals and people harmed by a wide range of different types of situations. And what the government does, if you look, for example, the Department of Labor budget, that's what the government does. It determines eligibility, it processes claims, it provides money, it figures out the actuarial tables. Government, it's a little bit clunky, but that is really what the federal government does all the time. And when we think about the financial issues, that was probably the most interesting part of the paper to me, being a finance wonk, to see that we really have evolved, along with hundreds and hundreds of programs, many different ways of compensating, of financing these different programs. So, for example, quite a number of programs are paid for through excise taxes. So if you are harmed by a vaccine, for example, say a childhood vaccine, every vaccine manufacturer pays 25 cents per vaccine that is administered per therapeutic area. So say the MMR would be 75 cents. No, sorry, they pay 75 cents per vaccine. So that would be $2.25 for the MMR vaccine. And that goes into a trust fund. So that is the resource that is used to pay out to those who are harmed through vaccines. If you're harmed by the COVID vaccines, there's a whole other program. And one of the things that we discovered in looking at all the programs and the financing is that there are always programs, and then somebody decides that they have identified someone who doesn't fit into the eligibility for that program. So there's another program and another program. So there's a program to compensate the main 100 crops through crop insurance for any kind of harms. And then there's another program to compensate all the crops that are not compensated in the primary program. So between direct reimbursement, insurance, which is used very widely. We insure people's bank accounts up to $250,000. We require, we subsidize enormously flood insurance for millions of people. We subsidize heavily and grant crop insurance. We provide a very wide range of kind of insurance mechanisms, which are often financed through banks. We see that there are a lot of creativity. There's a lot of creativity in what can finance different programs of reparatory compensation. So the upshot of all of this is that I feel that this effort needs both the drive and energy and passion of the young people like you to galvanize people to see the moral wrong, but it also needs something else, which is it needs people to begin asking, how is it that we provide reparations for people who are Christmas tree farmers and sardine fishermen and reindeer and emu and elk raisers, and yet the subject that was the greatest moral harm in our history still is not something that, apart from a few isolated pockets, we have a program of reparatory compensation for. And I think that, so in other words, it's going to take the activists and the passion and also the nerds to come together on this.
I love that. You just illustrated language that actually Professor Brooks gave me on how to describe this dilemma. Are reparations radical or routine? And you just described how routine it is to pay reparations. I mean, when you told me about Christmas tree farmers, that just blew my mind. I want to circle. We got our first question, and I want to encourage anyone who is watching to either post questions in the Zoom chat or upload your questions to the app. I have a sheet open and they'll populate if you have something to ask. But I want to circle back to the notion of narrative change that you just talked about, Ms. Florant. I want to just unpack what narrative change means. Is this selling the idea of reparations? Like what is that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a really good question. And thank you for asking about that, because we do not think about that as selling the idea. And we very explicitly even delineate between sort of like narrative change and like communications and strategic comms and messaging. And the way we think about the difference is that narrative is really about sort of the like collection of stories that then shape our worldviews and the mental models that we have about like how and why the world operates the way it operates. And so you could think about, there are deep narratives about the founding of this country, the myth of meritocracy and the bootstrapping narrative and the lost cause narrative, that are all actual barriers to us kind of getting to a place where sort of a narrative environment where reparations is really something that folks understand the need for, because we've been taught for so long that actually, oh no, this isn't structural, this is individual, and we know that's not true. And so our work around narrative change is going to be sort of a mix between trying to disrupt those narratives, but then also be ideating with the field about like what are the new narratives that we need to create and then amplify. And we draw from Rashad Robinson, the president of Color of Change's work on this. Obviously, they're a beautiful narrative change organization. And he talks about the sort of the process of being, learning, creating, broadcasting, and then immersing are these new narratives. And so our work is also going to follow that process. We're in the early days, we're in year 2 of our organization. And so we'll be focused on learning this year, but we'll be really trying to understand like what are the narratives that we want to bring forth in this movement? What are the narratives that are going to be really compelling for new audiences so that we're bringing new people into this movement, and helping people, and in particular non-Black folks, really see themselves in it and see sort of why this is so important. And I'll just name one other person I think who's been doing that for a long time is Bryan Stevenson. When you hear him talk about reparations, he's like, this is not just about folks who are receiving reparations. This is about the folks who, have been sort of implicated subjects in systems that have privileged some and disadvantaged others for 400 years. And all of us actually have to be active agents in the repair, and we all have something to gain from being active in it as well.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. It's funny, I've been watching this Twitter discussion between, I believe, journalist Chris Wallace and Nicole Hannah-Jones about the Black experience being foundational to how things have played out in this country. Yes. And some of the people who have been responding to talk about the people holding on to their mythologies, because he couldn't latch on to what she was actually trying to say. So thank you for unpacking narrative change. Sydney, did you want to address that in any sort of, yeah.
Sure, I'd love to jump in, yes. So I think, first of all, I just wanted to say, really appreciate what Dr. Bilmes has shared as well, about the practicality of it. I'm very excited to hear more. But I think, honestly, the idea of like selling this idea of reparations even betrays some limitations to the way that we're having the conversation about reparations still, with this sort of assumption that we need, that people would need to be coerced into being convinced that this is the way to go about things. And what I have found most interesting in, again, in these few years is that, for example, last summer we co-hosted, or we partnered with the ACLU during their summer institute, and we hosted workshops with high school and college students about reparations. And, without fail, every session that we had students stay after, the official session had ended, to say things like, I'd really never thought about this like this. I wasn't really sold on the idea. I'd kind of heard about it, but that made so much sense. And, I'm really, I really see this in a new way. And, those workshops largely just entailed conversation. We just talked about what happened in this place and like how has it affected people to this day, and what can be done about it, and what is the sort of imperative and the obligation to do something about it. So, when it comes to this idea of selling, it's like, for the most part, what we found is that you don't need to sell anyone on it. Like, you need to start the conversation and sort of engage in that conversation. And it's engagement that really develops on its own.
Thank you so much. So we have a question from Danya Lewis, who says, can you talk about the core pillars / criteria for reparations? And does the Evanston, Illinois example meet that criteria? And there's been some debate about that.
There has.
Who would like to take that on?
I mean, I could talk, Dr. Bilmes, do you want to talk about the UN basic principles?
It sounds like someone wants to ask, I probably know the least about this particular program. I mean, I would just, my comment on this is just that I don't imagine, if we think about this the way the government thinks about paying reparatory compensation, there isn't just one program. There are different kinds of programs because there are many, many harms. I mean, the harms are interrelated and have grown up. We have in our one of our great students, Hillary Anderson, drew a tree as a way of kind of depicting this, in which the roots were in slavery, and then there were all of the trunk was built up of a lot of different types of things, housing and education, criminal justice, and so on, that kind of interwove and grew into a tree, in which we have, and she took from the song, blood on the roots, blood on the leaves, to show what we have today. Now, things compounded and they interwove, and one way of looking at it is the way my friend Sandy Darity does, which is to say there is a $13 trillion wealth gap. And that is a way of representing all of these compounding types of harms. But there are, when you actually look at and you sort of unpack harms, there are many different kinds of harms, and there are many different ways of compensating harms. So, for example, one of Cornell's favorite stories, a woman I wished I could have met. She sounded like someone who would have been right up my alley, was Callie House, who in 1915 sued for $68 million, which was the amount of cotton tax collected between 1862 and 1868 based on involuntary labor. And she had calculated how much tax the federal government had received based on slave and involuntary servitude cotton. Now, even though that got actually further, that got pretty far along, that proposal. That's sort of another way to think about it, in addition to, say, 40 acres and a mule. But I imagine that a program that works well is going to have many different flavors. So, for example, those who, and once you start to unpack it, I think to a large extent, some of the opposition recedes, because people are generally more reluctant to accept a big idea than they are a specific proposal once they sort of hear the logic. For example, thinking about the GI Bill. The GI Bill was the major legislation of the past 100 years that produced the middle class that I grew up in. And my father was a World War II veteran. He was able to go to school on the GI Bill, to buy a house on the GI Bill. Now, there were, in World War II, 8% of those who fought were Black Americans. It was 10% of the Korean War veterans were Black, and almost none of them were able to access the benefits of the GI Bill. That was for a variety of reasons, although Blacks were not explicitly prevented from getting benefits under the GI Bill. The combination of trade union policies, discrimination policies in housing and lending, the fact that the states were given the task of actually implementing the GI Bill, and so many states completely discriminated, the fact that HBCU eligibility were tiny at the time and didn't have many fields of discipline in which to train people. And for all of these reasons, you have studies which show, for example, studies of 66,000 home mortgages awarded in New York. It's not in the South. Only 2 of them were given to Black Americans, in that period, in enormous injustice. But if you think about how to address that particular issue, a bill has been introduced with our encouragement by my former student, Seth Moulton, and Cornell's good friend, Congressman Clyburn and Raphael Warnock, which would pass the benefits of the GI Bill to the descendants of those who fought were discriminated against in those wars. Now, I don't see it as an either or thing, but I see this kind of as an illustration of how we take, because right now, if you are a veteran of the post 9/11 wars and you have the GI Bill, you can pass your unused benefits on to your children. And when you talk to people about this, people tend to say, like, oh yeah, don't we have that already? I mean, the conversation is almost one-sided. Now, whether or not Congress actually passes this, I don't know. But the thinking behind it is thinking which is very, I think, compatible with the idea of thinking that there are many kinds of reparation programs that need to be put in place. And there are many types of harms that need to be compensated. Some are easier to identify the classes than others.
I appreciate that. Thank you so much. That's some news we can use too. So we're at time, and so I just want to hear from each of our panelists before we wrap up. I'll give you a prompt, but also you can say basically whatever you want to say to make sure that this issue lands. And I want to revisit Ms. Florant's mention of the fact that repair benefits everyone. We've been asking this question at the Emancipator all week. How does addressing racial injustice benefit the whole? And so I'll start with you, Ms. Scott, and work my way to you, Ms. Florant, and then to you, Professor Bilmes. Oh, Sydney. Okay, yeah.
Sorry. I think that's a really interesting question, because I find that one of the, I guess, sort of barriers, and not barriers, but one of the frameworks that we encounter and that we sort of contend with in talking to students, especially, with people who are, unfamiliar with the idea of reparations, we try to give a lot of space for people to ask messy questions and, sort of, figure things out. And I think one of the interesting sort of frameworks that we have, that we sort of assume, is the idea that, and actually Aria brought it up earlier, is the idea of like the implicated subject. So you can sort of think of it as genealogically implicated, people who are, come from a sort of historical ancestral legacy, and also sort of socially or contextually implicated, in terms of how, the systems that you participate in, and, how essentially how you are implicated in those systems by your participation in them. And, it can sometimes be the kind of conversation that, stems from, for example, my family immigrated to this country, after chattel slavery, after, these specific things. Why should I be a part of this conversation? Why should I be implicated in this conversation? And I think that, so for those conversations, we obviously, we sort of talk about that idea of, the implicated subject. We talk about the idea that reparations is not a punitive act. It is not born out of, punishing someone. It's not trying to sort of the causal mechanism is, or at least sort of the moral causal mechanism is not taking money or, resources away from anyone. It's, it's providing them. And so that idea of, how do you, do I see myself as, needing to think about that and needing to be implicated in that? And I think that there's a lot of room to go beyond that as well. If you think about sort of like what I'm sure Dr. Bilmes can speak to this better than I can, but, sort of what are the financial and economic costs of having, a class of people that are not, that have not been able to build wealth and participate in, in wealth building activities. But also sort of, what does it mean sort of for our culture and society that continued participation in this system is in fact continued participation in, sort of these in the racial wealth gap and in the disparities that have been in practice for so long. And so I think, sort of morally, philosophically, at least how we contend with the world around us, I think it's a really valuable thing, honestly, to be able to implicate yourself in those systems and sort of be able to find benefit and find compassion in wanting to see, in wanting to see debt restored, in wanting to see harm rectified. I think that's something that everyone can genuinely have a stake in.
That's great. Actually, I'm going to go to Professor Bilmes, quick 30 seconds, and then I'm going to wrap up with you, Ms. Florant, okay? All right, Professor Bilmes. The question is being repair for everyone, and you're on mute.
Well, I think that the time is now. We should take responsibility for which is the social norm that we have in this country. We should take responsibility for mistakes that we have made in the past collectively. We should be on the right side of history. And we should also ask ourselves, why is it that we pay reparations to hundreds and hundreds of thousands of Americans we have hundreds of programs paying reparations to millions of Americans for everything but this.
Thank you so much. And Ms. Florant.
I'll jump in, and I want to add to Dr. Bilmes' answer from the last question too. I think as we think about what reparations is, we think about it as sort of four things: reckoning, acknowledgement, accountability, and redress. When we started this work, we asked what is repair, and we broke it down into those four components. And so redress is obviously the financial compensation pieces, but the reckoning and the acknowledgement and the accountability is also really important, because when we make these, when we compensate people, let's say we do close the racial wealth gap, we're going to have to figure out how to keep it closed. We're going to have to transform our systems to be able to stay vigilant so that it stays closed. And to do that, we actually have to understand the harm. We have to apologize for the harm. We have to hold ourselves accountable for continuing to understand the harm. And so I guess that's what I would say, like, about why is this for everyone? Like, if I harm someone, I want to know that if I don't apologize for that, it's going to eat at me. If I don't understand what harm I caused, it's going to eat at me. And so I just think that that's, we teach our children, like, it's so basic, right? We teach our children, if you hurt someone on the playground, you say sorry, right? And those ideals are currently not being represented in our government. And I think that's, to me, like why it's for everyone. It's about the alignment with our highest held beliefs about who this country is.
Thank you so much. Well, we're at time, everyone. I just want to say that I've been edified to be in your presence this morning. I want to thank Professor Brooks for making a space for us to convene today, and everyone behind Trotter 150. Thank you, and have a great weekend.
Thanks for having me.
Well, if I could just lift up a word of appreciation for this extraordinary panel on reparations to my co-author, Linda Bilmes, to Aria Florant, who I remember when she came to me, I think before this latest venture, and described a vision that I was certainly sold on from moment one, and to a new colleague in this work, Sydni Scott, who, you know, there are few people your age whose resume so intimidate me. And I just have to say I'm blessed to hear your comments and be inspired by the work that you have ahead of you. And to Deborah Douglas. Now, again, another shameless plug. The Emancipator, which is in the lineage and legacy of The Guardian, is forthcoming. I don't know the date, but it is forthcoming. So I'm encouraging all of our viewers and all the participants in this convening to look for The Emancipator, to subscribe and to support her work. And I want to thank you for moderating such an extraordinary conversation. And let us note, I believe Aria used, she said, lifted up these words. I believe she said, reparation is not a matter of if, but when, because I believe in my people. Now, I'd love for that to be true for our people, broadly, inclusively defined, meaning every American believes if, I should say, believes when, not if, because we believe in our capacity to come to terms with the past in the present as we reach for the future. So that panel on reparation leaves me hopeful. And I have to believe that all the things that William Monroe Trotter stood for decades ago would stand for today, are represented in what you lifted up, and will be represented in the work that you are bringing forward in this moment. So we want to thank them.